My name is Evelyn Callahan. I am 41 years old, and I hold the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Marine Corps. But none of that carried any weight with the people seated across from me in that courtroom. Not the decorations pinned to my uniform. Not the years I had devoted to risking everything on distant battlegrounds. Not the sacrifices, the ones nobody ever mentions when you return home to emptiness instead of celebration. In their eyes, I was nothing. A failure. A worthless soldier they could ridicule, dismiss, and throw aside the moment I stopped being useful. The people on the opposite side of that courtroom were not strangers. They were my own flesh and blood, my parents, my younger brother, Ryan. The very same people who once called me daughter and sister now regarded me with barely concealed contempt. They had come to claim everything. The house my grandfather had left behind, the land, the heritage. And there they sat, rigid and polished in tailored clothing, while their attorney portrayed me as unstable, absent, and unworthy. She chose deployments over her family. I heard my mother's voice cut through the air, brittle and cutting as shattered glass. She abandoned us, my father added with cold detachment. She no longer belongs here. I remained silent. I allowed them to speak because that was precisely what they expected, the quiet girl who never pushed back, the soldier who simply followed orders. What they did not know was that I had been preparing for this moment far longer than any of them could conceive. I watched their expressions shift as I reached into my briefcase. I felt the atmosphere of the entire room change as I withdrew a single sheet of paper, neatly folded, its edges worn from the countless times my fingers had traced it in the darkness. It wasn't thick. It wasn't theatrical. It was plain, but it meant everything. I passed it to my attorney, who placed it wordlessly on the judge's bench. And then it happened. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and weary eyes, read the name printed at the top of that document. She paused, her breath caught, and then, without uttering a single word, she slowly pushed back her chair and rose, silent, composed, respectful. Her gaze found mine, not as opponents, not as plaintiff and defendant, but as two individuals who shared an understanding most people will never reach. Before anyone else could react, I heard the footsteps. 12 Marines in full dress blues entered through the rear of the courtroom, their movements precise, deliberate, and flawless. They halted shoulder to shoulder, forming a quiet line of honor. And then they saluted. The room went completely still. The smirks disappeared from my parents' faces. My brother's composed facade fractured. The lawyer who had referred to me as a lowly soldier only minutes earlier let her pen slip from her fingers. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because in that moment, every person present understood they had mistaken my silence for fragility. They had mistaken my gentleness for surrender. And now it was far too late. I wish I could tell you I felt victorious, that I smiled, that revenge tasted sweet on my lips. But the truth is, all I felt was stillness, a profound, quiet ache where love had once lived. I had not fought this battle for money, nor for land, nor for an inheritance. I fought because there are moments when you must remind the world of who you truly are, even if it means standing alone, even if it means confronting the very people who should have cherished you most. As I stood there, unmoved and unwavering, I thought back to the words my grandfather once whispered to me when I was still a child. Family isn't determined by blood. It's determined by who remains beside you when the world turns cold. That day, I stood alone, but I also stood free. The judge's voice, when it finally returned, was measured but unshakable. Lieutenant Colonel Callahan, please be seated. The court recognizes your service. And as I settled back into my chair, the Marines behind me lowered their salutes in perfect unison. My parents said nothing. They had no words left. It was too late, and that was only the beginning. They say that childhood shapes you. I wish I could say mine shaped me into something tender, something unburdened, but that would be dishonest. I grew up in a household where love was transactional, if it existed at all. I was the firstborn, the unwanted daughter, the disappointment my parents could never quite conceal. My father, Robert Callahan, was a man of few words but abundant criticism. He moved through the world like someone who believed it owed him something and resented everyone who reminded him otherwise. My mother, Diane, was more complicated, beautiful once, I believe, sharp-driven. But whatever dreams she had nurtured as a young woman had been extinguished early by family expectations and the suffocating narrowness of our town. I remember overhearing her once when I was 7. She was drinking at a neighbor's backyard gathering, her words loose and bitter. "I wanted to enlist, you know," she slurred with a hollow laugh. "I wanted to be something. But my father said that wasn't for girls. So I married instead. Settled. Had kids." The way she said "had kids," as though it were a burden she had never wanted, as though I were the weight dragging her under. She never struck me. It was never that visible. But the words she chose, the silences she weaponized, those leave marks too. Sometimes marks that go deeper than any fist. I was the child she barely glanced at. The child she never spoke about with pride. The child she punished with indifference. There was only one person in that house who ever made me feel truly seen. My grandfather, Harold Callahan, a Korean War veteran with hands like worn leather and eyes as soft as a winter sky. He was the only one who noticed when I brought home my first A. The only one who cheered from the sidelines at my clumsy little soccer matches. The only one who, when I was 12 and weeping quietly in the corner after my mother accused me of showing off for winning the spelling bee, came and sat beside me without a word and simply stayed. He was not a talkative man. The war had taken that from him, I think. But when he did speak, his words carried weight. I still remember the night. Everything shifted. I was 15, fresh from another confrontation. This one because I told my parents I wanted to apply for the ROTC program at school. My mother's face twisted with revulsion. "You are not joining the military," she snapped. "No daughter of mine is going to throw her life away like that. You think they care about you? You think they'll ever see you as anything more than disposable?" My father simply laughed. "Don't waste your time," he muttered. "You'll quit like you quit everything else." I fled to the porch, slid down against the cold wood planks, and buried my face in my knees. That's when I heard the soft creak of the old screen door. My grandfather. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. He sat down beside me, drew a worn silver lighter from his pocket, flicked it once, an old habit from his soldiering days, and said quietly, "Don't let small people tell you how big you can be." I looked up confused. He smiled, gentle, tired. "They tried to stop me too," he said. "Told me I wasn't smart enough, strong enough, good enough. But I went anyway. I fought anyway. And I came home, not because I was the best." He paused, lighting a cigarette, "but because I refused to let anyone else write my story." I said nothing. I simply let those words settle into my bones. That night, I made my decision. I would leave. I would join the Marines. I would become something greater than the daughter they despised. I worked 2 jobs to cover the application fees. I ran 5 miles every morning before school. I studied harder than I ever had. And on my 17th birthday, I signed the enlistment papers. No celebración, no fanfare. Just me, a recruiter with kind eyes, and a quiet promise to myself that I would never, ever allow anyone to make me feel small again. Leaving home was not dramatic. There was no slamming door, no shouting match. There was only silence, an untouched cold breakfast, a father who did not lift his eyes from his newspaper, a mother who, as I walked out the door carrying my single duffel bag, said flatly, "You'll be back. Girls like you always come back." But I never did. I wish I could tell you the Marines welcomed me like a returning daughter. They did not. The Corps breaks you down before building you back up. And for a girl like me, slender, overlooked, carrying the weight of a lifetime of not being enough, it was grueling. But I endured it. More than that, I thrived. I advanced through the ranks not because I was the strongest, God knows I wasn't, nor because I was the most gifted, though I was stubborn enough to learn quickly. I rose because I refused to surrender. Because every time I collided with a wall, I heard my grandfather's voice in my head. "Don't let small people tell you how big you can be." I made it. Lieutenant-colonel, combat déploiement, commendation. I built a life I was genuinely proud of. But the one thing I never anticipated, the one thing I never saw coming, was that the people I had left behind, the family I believed I'd finally outrun, would one day come for me again. Not with fists or words, but with something colder and sharper. Legal documents, deception, and betrayal. And that is where this story truly begins. 15 years. That is how long it had been since I last set foot in my hometown. 15 years since I packed my entire life into one small bag and left without a backward glance. I told myself I would never return. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not even for farewells. But death has a way of drawing you home, even when that home no longer truly belongs to you. It was the news of my grandfather's passing that brought me back. A brief call from a lawyer. No warmth, no compassion. Mr. Harold Callahan has passed. The service is this Saturday. You're listed as a relative. That was all. No message from my mother. No word from my father or brother. Just silence. The same silence they had offered me throughout my entire life. I drove 12 hours straight, stopping only for gas. I did not sleep. I did not allow myself to think about how I would be received. Somewhere deep within, I already knew. When I pulled into town, it was unchanged. The same cracked sidewalks, the same faded storefronts. Nothing had shifted except me. I parked 2 blocks from the church. There were already too many vehicles in the lot. Too many familiar faces in dark clothing gathered on the steps. I could feel the stares before I had even stepped out of the car. I wore my dress blues. Not to make a statement, not to draw attention, but because my grandfather, Harold Callahan, had always said that a uniform was a pledge to serve, to protect, to stand for something. He deserved to be honored, even if no one else in that building believed so. As I approached the church, my parents were the first to notice. My mother's gaze moved over me slowly, deliberately. She did not smile, did not wave, did not move. My father crossed his arms, pressing his lips into that familiar thin line I remembered from childhood, the one that signaled disapproval and disgust. Ryan, my brother, glanced up from his phone only briefly before leaning toward his wife to whisper something. They laughed at their sister, the woman who had buried friends, borne the weight of command, cradled broken soldiers in her arms, and still somehow was never enough for them. Not a single person spoke to me. I climbed the church steps, nodded politely, kept my expression composed. Inside, however, I felt the old wounds beginning to tear open. There was no seat for me. Every pew was occupied. My family, the same family who had once shared a dinner table with me, who had taken my grandfather's generosity and twisted it into entitlement, made no effort to accommodate me. I stood at the rear of the church in full uniform, alone. I watched as his casket was carried down the aisle. I stood upright, hands at my sides, heart pounding in the stillness. As the service progressed, I noticed something was wrong. There was no mention of me, not in the pastor's words, not in the obituary, not in the family acknowledgments. The man who had been my only source of warmth, the only one who had ever called me brave, and I had been erased as though I had never existed. The ache in my chest was not new, but it was sharper than I had remembered. After the service, I approached the casket alone. My parents, my brother, their acquaintances, they remained huddled together, whispering. No one followed me. No one interrupted. I rested my hand on the polished wood and drew a slow breath. "Thank you," I whispered, "for seeing me, for believing in me when no one else did." I felt tears threaten, but I blinked them away. I would not allow them to see me weep. Not here, not now. As I turned to leave, I caught fragments of conversation. A cousin I barely recognized mentioning something about the house, about the will, about how, of course, Diane and Robert were inheriting everything, how it was the proper outcome, how Evelyn had never really been part of the family anyway. I kept walking. I did not stop. I did not react. But the words clung to me, heavy and rotten. Back at my motel, I could not sleep. The memories kept circling. The way my mother's eyes had narrowed when she saw me. The way my father had not even extended his hand. The empty seat that should have been mine. Something was wrong. Something was not adding up. My grandfather was not a wealthy man, but he was meticulous, detail-oriented. A man who had once told me, a legacy isn't about money. It's about ensuring your voice continues to speak after you're gone. And this did not feel like his voice. I pulled out my phone and searched the name of the attorney who had contacted me. It took less than an hour to confirm the first irregularity. The reading of the will had already taken place, without me, without even notifying me. I sat in the dim motel room, the hum of the aging air conditioner filling the quiet, and I felt it. That same cold certainty I had carried into battlefields. The same gut instinct that had preserved my life more times than I could count. Something was very, very wrong, and whatever it was, I was going to uncover it. Not for revenge, not for money, but because Harold Callahan had raised me better than to turn away from the truth. I had come home for a funeral, but I was about to discover something far greater, something my family believed they had buried permanently. And this time, I was not leaving until justice had been served. There's a moment just before a battle commences when every instinct sharpens. The air goes still, time seems to slow, and you understand without question that something is coming. That was precisely how the morning after the funeral felt. I could not shake the sense that something was wrong. Not merely emotionally, not simply the cold reception from my family, but something deeper, something deliberate. It was evident I was not meant to be there. And the more I replayed the details in my mind, the missing seat, the sideways glances, the hushed voices, the more I felt the pressure of something concealed bearing down on me. I did what I'd been trained to do. I went to work. I began with the fundamentals, public records, county filings, property deeds. It was not difficult. Years in military intelligence teaches you to identify patterns, to follow trails that most people overlook. The first warning sign was immediate. The will that had supposedly been filed the previous month, the one bequeathing everything to my parents and brother, had been submitted just 3 weeks before my grandfather's death. Too recent, too convenient. I knew my grandfather. He was the type of man who kept his affairs in careful order. He would not have waited until the final hour to alter his wishes. I dug deeper. I requested a copy of the document under the state's public records law. It arrived by email that afternoon, a scanned PDF. At first glance, it appeared legitimate. Proper legal letterhead, neatly typed, signed, dated. But something seized my attention. The signature. It was not right. Too rigid. Too clean. My grandfather's authentic signature. I had dozens of examples in old birthday cards, letters, even a pocket knife he had engraved for me as a child. Was more fluid, more organic. I enlarged the signature on my laptop and studied it until the pieces aligned. It was a forgery, a competent one, but a forgery nonetheless. I kept digging. The attorney listed as having prepared the will, Anthony Carroll, did not exist. No bar number, no law office, nothing but a name. Fabricated. It was not merely careless. It was insulting. They had not even tried particularly hard because they had never anticipated I would return, had never imagined I would question anything. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding, not from shock, but from the glacial calm that descends when suspicion hardens into certainty. They had stolen his legacy, and they were preparing to steal mine. I knew who was responsible before I even made the calls. It was not difficult to deduce. Ryan, my younger brother, the golden child, the one who had never quite managed to hold a job, who had always coasted on charm and other people's resources. I started with his financial records, public liens, bankruptcy filings, court documents. It was worse than I had imagined. 3 failed businesses, 2 lawsuits, a defaulted mortgage, credit card debt in the 6 figures. And then there was the house, my grandfather's house, the one he had constructed with his own hands, the one I had assumed would be preserved or passed on with dignity. According to county filings, that property was already being transferred into Ryan's name. The paperwork had been submitted the day after my grandfather's death. This was not grief. It was not love. It was greed. And my parents were not innocent bystanders. I pulled their records, property holdings, tax filings, social club memberships. My father's position at the hardware store did not explain the luxury SUV in the driveway. My mother's community fundraising did not account for the designer accessories and country club dues. They were all involved, every one of them. The more I assembled the picture, the clearer it became. They had forged the will. They had exploited the legal system. And they had erased me entirely because they were confident I was too distant, too preoccupied, too damaged to fight back. They were wrong. I did not confront them. Not yet. Confrontation is always the final step. First, you gather. You observe. You construct the case. That night, I drove to the old house, my grandfather's house. I parked down the street with my lights off and simply watched. The porch light was burning. Laughter drifted from the living room. Ryan's car in the driveway. My father's truck. My mother's laughter, sharp, brittle, familiar. I thought about the evenings I'd spent on that porch as a child, how my grandfather would sit with me in the darkness pointing out the constellations, how he taught me to tie knots and read maps, how he once said to me after I came home in tears from school, "Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you are the ones who teach you how to survive without them." I remained there for over an hour. Then I drove away. I did not knock. I did not announce myself. I gave no indication I was onto them. The following morning, I contacted an attorney specializing in probate fraud and began quietly amassing every piece of evidence available: financial transfers, signature analysis, witness statements. And I kept my silence. I smiled when they called me the forgotten daughter. I nodded politely when my mother made passive-aggressive remarks about career women and neglected family values. I pretended ignorance, because sometimes silence is more powerful than any outcry. I was not going to fight them in the mud. I was not going to lower myself to their level. But I was going to reclaim what was mine, with precision, with dignity, and with the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the truth, once brought into the light, carries a weight no lie can outpace. They had mocked me as a lowly soldier, but they had overlooked something essential. I had spent my entire life learning how to endure impossible odds, and I was not going to lose. Not this time. The cruelest pain is not physical. It is not the sharp bite of shrapnel or the scorching heat of a battlefield wound. It is the quiet kind, the kind that seeps into your bones when the people you love look straight through you, as though you were never truly there. I had faced death. I had faced chaos. I had stood in the center of gunfire, so dense it obliterated all thought. But nothing has ever felt as brutal as the silence that greeted me every time I came home. When you are deployed, you construct your world from fragments, stolen moments between missions, and you cling to whatever connection you can find. Letters, photographs, the sound of a familiar voice across a crackling phone line. But for me, those lines were always quiet. I remember the first time I came home on leave. 9 months had passed without seeing my family. I was 23, recently promoted, still carrying the naive hope that perhaps this time they would be proud. I stepped off that bus in my dress blues, boots polished, medals gleaming, and no one was there. Not my parents, not my brother. No handmade sign, no smiles. Only the cold sting of winter wind and the realization that I had returned to no one. I made my way to the house and knocked. My mother opened the door with a surprised expression, as though I were an unexpected guest rather than her daughter returning from the other side of the world. "Oh," she said flatly, "didn't know you were coming. No imbras, no quorums." Just those words. I stayed 2 days, a mistake I would not often repeat. For most of that time, they barely acknowledged me. Ryan had friends over, filling the house with noise and laughter I was not part of. My father barely glanced away from the television. My mother smiled politely when I spoke, but her eyes, those eyes, never softened. I left early, catching the first available bus back to base, and when I sent a text to say I had arrived safely, there was no reply. I learned quickly: expect no answers, expect no calls, expect nothing from them. The military became my home. My fellow soldiers became my family. But no matter how intensively you train, no matter how many medals they fasten to your chest, certain wounds refuse to close. Certain silences travel with you. I can still see the faces of young Marines I held in my arms as they bled out. The ones who never came home, whose mothers would have surrendered anything for one last chance to see them walk through the door. And yet, I came home to indifference, as though I had never existed. One night during a deployment in Helmand Province, I sat beneath a fractured moon, dust hanging in the air, the distant roll of gunfire carrying across the desert. And I thought, I would rather die here, surrounded by people who would give their lives for me, than endure one more day in a house where I am invisible. That thought stayed with me long after the fighting ceased, long after the medals were polished and the uniforms put away. Because some of the darkest, most exhausting battles do not unfold in the field. They happen in the silence, in the places you are supposed to feel most protected. I believed I had buried those feelings, believed I had fortified myself sufficiently. But returning from my grandfather's funeral, seeing them again, all of it resurfaced like shrapnel working its way back through the skin. And then I found the letter. It was by chance, buried beneath old photographs in the attic of the house he had left behind. A small envelope, yellowed with age, my name written in shaky but unmistakable handwriting. Evelyn. I sat down right there on the dusty floor. My hands trembled as I opened it, and as I read the words, something inside me fractured, and something else, something steady and resilient, was born in its place. Kiddo, the letter began. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, I need you to know one thing. I see you. I have always seen you. I stopped, breathed. Read on. I know what it means to be the outsider. I know what it is to carry the weight of a family that cannot understand you. But I also know this. You are stronger than all of them combined. Not because of medals or rank, but because you have a heart that still chooses to serve even when you have been cast aside. I felt tears sting my eyes. I had not wept in years, not since my first deployment, not since I taught myself that tears do not stop bullets. But there in that attic, I let them fall. The letter continued. I am proud of you. I may not have said it often enough, but I am. You are the best of this family, Evelyn. And when the moment arrives, because I believe it will, you will stand taller than any of them ever imagined. Because you carry something they do not, integrity. Never allow them to take that from you. The signature at the bottom was unsteady but genuine. Harold Callahan, my grandfather, the only person who had ever loved me without conditions. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it inside my jacket, and remained there for a long time. Long after the attic grew dark, long after the weight of that house pressed in around me. Because in that moment I understood. This was not merely about property. It was not merely about money. It was about dignity, about refusing to be erased. And I made a vow right then and there that I would see this through. Not for the money, not for retribution, but for the girl I once was, the one who kept waiting for her family to notice her, and for the soldier I had become, the one who had learned to stand alone. The following morning, I made a decision that altered everything. I reached out to General Linda Brooks. Some believe the military is cold, rigid, a place where rank and protocol supersede humanity. But there are exceptions. General Brooks was one of them, the kind of leader who remembered names, who noticed the quiet ones at the back of the room, who understood that not all wars are waged on foreign soil. She had been my commanding officer years ago, when I was still finding my footing in a system that did not seem to have space for women who refused to fit the mold. She had recognized something in me back then, something I had not yet seen in myself. I had not spoken to her in nearly 5 years, but some instincts do not fade. I typed her name into my secure phone, hands trembling slightly. It felt absurd. Who was I to ask for her help with something so personal, so tangled? And yet I pressed send. Ma'am, I hope this isn't out of line. I need your advice. Family matter. Possible legal implications. Possible fraud. I trust no one else. Evelyn Callahan. I expected nothing. I expected silence. Instead, less than 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Callahan, come see me tomorrow. 0900, my office. Brooks. That was all. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the old kitchen table of the house I had inherited, at least on paper, staring at faded photographs of people who no longer felt like family. My grandfather's letter lay folded on the table beside me. I traced its edges with my fingertips, reading his words over and over until they were engraved in my memory. The next morning, I put on my dress uniform. It still fit. The medals still gleamed. The insignia still carried meaning. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. Not the girl who had once stood on this porch waiting to be acknowledged, but the woman who had learned to stand without applause, without anyone's approval. I drove 2 hours to the base where General Brooks maintained her office. Her aide greeted me with a measured nod and guided me down polished corridors lined with framed commendations and photographs of battles both won and lost. When I entered her office, she was already standing, composed, straight-backed. Her silver hair pulled into the same sharp bun I remembered, but her eyes were soft. "Evelyn," she said, using my first name. "Sit down." I did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She studied me the way she always had, not looking at my uniform, but at me, the person beneath the medals. "Tell me," she said simply. So I did. I told her everything. The forged will, the cold reception, the methodical erasure, my brother's debts, my parents' fear of exposure, the way they had tried to diminish me, to remove me from my own history. And I told her about the letter, about my grandfather, about the only man who had ever believed I was more than the labels they assigned me. When I finished, my throat felt raw. General Brooks sat back, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I feared I had made a mistake. Then she spoke. "They're underestimating you," she said quietly. "That's their first mistake." I blinked. "They see the uniform," she continued, "but they don't see the woman wearing it. They think you're just a soldier. They don't realize you're a strategist." Her words struck something deep inside me. "I don't know where to begin," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded once. "We begin with the facts. Emotion doesn't win battles. Evidence does." She leaned forward, pulling a legal pad toward her. "We're going to map this out. Every name, every transaction, every inconsistency. We approach this the way we would an intelligence breach." Something inside me steadied. The soldier in me assumed command. This was not about wounded feelings. This was about facts, evidence, and strategy. For the next 3 hours, we worked. Her questions were pointed and precise. I answered them all. I showed her the forged signatures, the discrepancies in dates, the abrupt changes in my family's financial behavior. When I faltered, she steadied me, one step at a time. "You have faced worse than this." By the time we finished, there was a working blueprint, a timeline of deception, a network of lies, a map of betrayal. I sat back and exhaled. For the first time in weeks, my breathing felt controlled. She looked at me with something almost maternal. "Evelyn," she said softly, "I have watched you lead men and women into situations most people cannot fathom. You have saved lives, made impossible calls. This is just another battlefield, and you are not alone." I felt something constrict in my chest. Something old, something fragile. "Why are you helping me?" I asked quietly. She smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "Because once upon a time, I was you," she whispered, "and no one helped me." The room fell silent. The weight of those words sank deep into my bones. I rose. She did the same. "Thank you," I said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. She placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "We'll get them," she said simply. "One step at a time." As I left her office, the sun broke through the overcast sky. I stepped outside into the cold air, the wind catching the edges of my uniform. And for the first time in weeks, I felt steady on my feet. I was not fighting only for myself. I was fighting for the woman I had become. And I was not fighting alone. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and razor sharp. I stood before the mirror, fastening the last silver button on my dress blues. My fingers moved with practiced precision, muscle memory refined over decades of service. The medals on my chest caught the pale light filtering through the window. Small fragments of metal that meant nothing to most people, but to me represented battles survived and sacrifices made. And yet, standing there, I did not feel like a decorated Marine. I felt like a woman walking deliberately into a battlefield far more unforgiving than any I had encountered overseas, the family courtroom. I arrived alone. No fanfare, no audience, no one waiting on the courthouse steps, just me, my uniform, and the quiet resolve I'd spent years cultivating. Inside, the room was already partially filled. I spotted them immediately, my parents seated side by side, wearing the stiff, practiced expressions that come from years of social performance. My brother Ryan sat next to them, jaw tight, fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the table. Across from them, their attorney, sharp suit, Sharper eyes sorted through papers. They did not look at me when I entered. Or perhaps they did, but I did not meet their gaze. I kept my chin elevated, my steps measured. The click of my polished shoes against the floor sounded impossibly loud in the silence of that room. I took my seat beside Franklin, General Brooks's trusted attorney. He gave me a brief nod, calm and composed. I returned it, my expression unreadable. Judge Patricia Holloway, a stern woman of measured authority, entered moments later, and the room rose as one. When we sat again, I caught, just for an instant, a flicker of expression on my mother's face. A smirk, a thin, bitter line of amusement. Your Honor, their attorney began smoothly. We are here today to address the matter of the estate of the late Mr. Walter Callahan. My chest tightened slightly at the sound of my grandfather's name, but I said nothing. He said. I listened. I waited. Their case unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. They portrayed me as the estranged daughter, the one who departed, the one who turned her back on her family for a military career that, in their words, isolated her from the values and traditions of the Callahan family. I kept my gaze forward. I allowed them to speak. They presented my deployments as though they were character defects. They discussed my absence during birthdays and holidays, never once acknowledging that I had sent gifts, cards, and calls that were received with silence. They questioned my stability, my suitability to inherit anything bearing the Callahan name. And then came the mockery, as expected. She has always wanted to wear that uniform, to feel important, my mother said just below her breath, but with enough volume for the room to absorb. Ryan emitted a barely suppressed laugh. Even the attorney allowed herself a smirk. The judge raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. I remained still, not because the words did not sting, but because I had long since learned that power lives in stillness. When my turn arrived, I rose slowly. The courtroom felt impossibly small. Every eye trained on me. The air weighted with judgment. I spoke clearly, steadily, without anger. My name is Evelyn Callahan. I am 41 years old. I have served this country for more than 2 decades as an officer in the United States Marine Corps. I am not here today to defend my service. I am here to speak the truth. My voice did not falter. I explained, step by step, how I had returned from my grandfather's funeral only to discover a new will had materialized, one I had never encountered. I detailed the irregularities in signatures, the inconsistencies in dates. I described, without embellishment, how I had been excluded, how no one had informed me of the funeral arrangements, how no seat had been reserved for me at the service. My voice remained level. My words were precise. I did not weep. I did not accuse. I presented facts. At one point, my father scoffed audibly. She has always been dramatic, he muttered. The judge directed a warning glance at him, but I did not react, because I understood this was not the moment for anger. This was the moment to let the truth descend like quiet thunder. I continued. I explained how, through proper legal channels, I had conducted an investigation, how records of financial transfers and sudden increases in spending had emerged, how the forged will had benefited a single party, Ryan, and how that fact alone raised serious legal and ethical questions. Franklin, to his credit, kept his interventions to a minimum. He understood I required no rescue. I could see the judge was genuinely listening, tracking every word, every gesture. But my family was not listening. They were smirking, exchanging glances, whispering to one another as though the outcome were already predetermined. I felt the weight of the uniform on my shoulders, not as armor, but as memory, as testament. Every deployment, every sleepless night, every sacrifice had led to this moment. And still they mocked. The final blow arrived when my mother leaned slightly toward their attorney, her voice deliberately audible. She's just a soldier, she said. What does she know about family? About legacy? I did not move. But inside, something clicked into place. Because in that moment, I understood it was not purely greed that drove them. It was contempt, a deep-rooted conviction that regardless of what I had accomplished, regardless of who I had become, I would never be sufficient in their eyes. I had never been enough. Not at 7, not at 17, not even now. But this time, I was not present for their approval. I was present for the truth. When I returned to my seat, Franklin offered the smallest nod. "You did well," he murmured. But I barely heard him because I knew the real confrontation was still ahead. I settled back into my chair, hands resting calmly in my lap. But inside, my heart beat steady as a drum line before a decisive engagement. Franklin stood smoothly. "Your Honor, with your permission, we would like to submit 2 critical pieces of evidence for the court's consideration." The judge, her expression unreadable, tilted her head slightly. "Proceed." Franklin gestured to me, and I rose, drawing from my case 2 documents that had felt like burning coals in my hands for weeks. My grandfather's original will and the final letter he had ever written to me. The one concealed deep inside a hollowed-out copy of a farewell to arms, the one intended for my eyes alone. I handed them to the bailiff. The room shifted. I could sense it in the air. Judge Patricia Holloway adjusted her glasses and began to read. The courtroom was so silent I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and relentless. Across from me, my family stirred uncomfortably. My mother's lips pressed together, her fingers gripping the armrest. Ryan's knee bounced beneath the table. My father leaned in to whisper to their attorney, whose composure began to visibly falter. Because they understood. I had the truth. The judge read in silence for what felt like a lifetime. Then she carefully set the papers down, removed her glasses, and let her eyes travel slowly across the room before settling on me. "Miss Callahan," she said softly, "would you mind approaching the bench?" I rose without hesitation. Franklin followed. As we stepped forward, the judge's voice dropped to something almost reverent. "This letter," she murmured, more to herself than to us, "is the kind of testament that speaks more powerfully than any legal argument." She glanced down at the signature, my grandfather's distinctive looping script, and then something occurred that I had not anticipated. She stood. It was not a procedural requirement. It was not compelled by law. It was something different, something deeper. She rose as if to honor something long overlooked. Her gaze, now softened, moved to my uniform. "You served," she said quietly. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." I answered, my voice steady. "Marinko, 23 years." She nodded once, slowly, and then something profound shifted on her face. "I did too," she whispered. Desert Storm. For a brief moment, the courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was 2 veterans meeting across time, across different wars, different battles, but bound by a single shared code: honor. She straightened. "Thank you for your service, Colonel." The word, Colonel, hung in the air. I did not correct her, because she knew, and then the unimaginable occurred. Judge Patricia Holloway turned to the room and announced, her voice ringing clear. "Out of respect, I ask all present service members to rise." The Marines stationed at the rear of the room, men and women I did not even know, stood as one. Their boots echoed against the wooden floor as they came to attention. Hands rose to foreheads in crisp, precise salutes. I felt the breath seize in my throat. My parents silent, my brother motionless, the attorney speechless, the room utterly still. The weight of the moment settled into every corner. No one laughed, no one smirked, because it was too late. Too late for their fabrications, too late for their ridicule, too late for their carefully constructed illusions. The truth had arrived, and with it came the quiet variety of justice, the kind that does not shout or gloat. It simply stands. The judge returned her eyes to the documents. This original will, written in Mr. Walter Callahan's own hand, supersedes any subsequent documents submitted to this court. Furthermore, she continued, her voice now edged with iron, the letter accompanying this will clearly indicate his intention to leave his estate to Miss Callahan, whom he described as the only one worthy of carrying the family name forward. I swallowed hard. I had not known he had written those words. Across the room, my mother's face drained of all color. My father sagged against the table. Ryan's hands trembled. The judge settled back in her seat, but the atmosphere of the room would never recover to its previous state. The transformation was permanent. Franklin cleared his throat. "Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, We respectfully request dismissal of all claims filed by the opposing party and immediate recognition of the original testamentary documents." The judge nodded, concurred. This court recognizes the validity of the original will and grants sole inheritance to Ms. Evelyn Callahan. Furthermore, she added, her voice cooling, given the evidence of potential fraud, this matter will be forwarded for criminal review. I exhaled softly, not in triumph. There was no triumph here, only truth and the price it carries. The gavel came down once, sharp, definitive. The courtroom stirred, but I remained still. My parents frozen. Ryan, head bowed, face buried in his hands. I felt no anger. I felt no desire for revenge. What I felt was release. I gathered my papers quietly. Franklin whispered, "Well done." I barely heard him. As I turned to leave, the Marines who had held their positions maintained their composure. I gave them the smallest nod, a wordless acknowledgement between soldiers, and they returned it crisp and solemn. Outside, the cold air struck my face and I breathed. For the first time in years, I could truly breathe. The battle was not entirely over. There would be consequences, headlines, lawyers, possibly criminal proceedings. But that moment, that singular moment, was mine, not because I had won, but because I had not broken. I walked away, standing taller, and I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it. Unbroken, unbowed, free. The headlines arrived faster than I could absorb them. Local newspapers, online forums, the evening news, each headline more jarring than the last. Decorated Marine wins court battle against family fraud. Prominent Callahan family accused of will tampering. The truth, once so carefully concealed, had torn its way into the open. I observed it unfold, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a kind of detached quietude, like standing on the shore while the tide recedes, carrying away everything that had once seemed permanent. I did not contact my parents. I had no need to. The community spoke on my behalf. Within days, my family's carefully curated social circle began to dissolve. Whispers accompanied them into every room, every grocery store aisle, every church pew. Their faces, once emblems of respectability, were now marked by something no amount of effort could remove: shame. Ryan lost his position first. The financial firm that employed him issued a brief, measured statement about integrity and community values. His name went unmentioned, but the implication was unmistakable. My mother's volunteer roles evaporated one by one. The same women she had once presided over at charity functions now avoided her gaze. Invitations ceased. Doors no longer opened. My father, stoic, proud, always composed, began to walk with a stoop, as though the cumulative weight had finally compressed something irreplaceable deep within him. I did not smile when I heard. I did not celebrate. I simply sat with the knowledge. Grief, in its own way, was the loudest presence in the room, because for all the harm they had inflicted, all the deceptions and betrayals, they were still my family. The faces I had known since childhood, the voices that had once tucked me into bed, and yet the people I had returned to were not the same as those I remembered. The courtroom had not destroyed us. We had destroyed ourselves long before the gavel came down. In the weeks that followed, people in town treated me differently. Some with warmth, some with pity, others with cautious admiration. But I had no need of their endorsement. I was not seeking applause. I had not fought to win their favor. I had fought to reclaim something far simpler: the right to occupy my own life without apology. I moved back into the house my grandfather had left me. It required repairs, needed life breathed back into it. But I found solace in the peeling paint and uneven floorboards. It was mine. More than that, it was his. And through it, in some meaningful way, he remained with me. One afternoon, while sanding down an old banister, I heard footsteps. When I turned, I saw her, my mother. She stood on the front porch, thin and drawn, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind carried the scent of autumn leaves between us. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to. She trailed off, staring at her hands as though searching for words she no longer possessed. I did not speak. I did not invite her in. I waited. Finally, she exhaled and shook her head. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said softly. "I don't know if I can forgive myself." I nodded once, a small, measured gesture. She turned and descended the porch steps, and I let her go. Not out of cruelty, but because I knew some distances cannot be bridged. Not then, perhaps not ever, and that was acceptable. The weeks dissolved into months. The scandal faded from the front pages, displaced by newer tragedies and fresher gossip. People moved on, as they always do, but I did not return to who I had been. I spent my days restoring the house, room by room, a window here, a creaking step there. Each nail driven and each stroke of the brush was an act of quiet defiance, of survival. At night, I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, my grandfather's letter tucked safely in my jacket pocket. Some evenings I read it, others I simply held it, letting the weight of the paper remind me that the past, while painful, was not the entirety of my story. I thought often about justice, about what it truly means. Because justice does not always resemble a courtroom victory. It does not always come with applause or headlines. Sometimes justice is quieter. Sometimes it is simply the act of refusing to be erased. I no longer hated my family. Not anymore. Pity, perhaps. Sadness, certainly. But hatred, no. I had left that on the courtroom floor. What they had done had cost them everything they once treasured. The community, the respect, the illusion of perfection. And it had cost me 2 years I could never reclaim, and wounds that would never fully close. But it had also returned something to me, something no amount of betrayal could ever take away. Myself, the real me, the woman who had held her ground, faced the storm, and had not flinched. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard the distant sound of children's laughter drifting from down the street. Life had always moved forward, and for the first time in a long while, I smiled, a genuine smile. Not born from victory, not born from revenge, born from peace. Because at last I was free, and that, after everything, was enough. I did not understand the meaning of legacy until I had nothing left to prove. The court proceedings were behind me. The family I had once tried so desperately to belong to had receded into the background of my life, still present like old scars, but no longer directing my every movement. And for the first time in years, I could breathe with ease. The inheritance from my grandfather exceeded what I had anticipated. The house, of course, but also savings he had quietly accumulated over decades, investments I had never known about. A reserved man who never boasted, who had nonetheless built something solid and enduring, waiting for the right hands to receive it. I thought carefully about what to do with it. It would have been easy to spend it on myself. A new home, a new vehicle, a fresh beginning somewhere far removed from all of this. But that was not the person he had shaped me to be. Instead, I directed a portion of the funds towards something I wished had existed during my own childhood. The Callahan Foundation, a scholarship program for children of military families. It was not ostentatious. It did not generate headlines, but it was real. And for the first time, I felt I was constructing something larger than myself, something with permanence. I named the first scholarship in his honor, the Harold Callahan Award for Resilience. Each time I signed the letters to recipients, I felt something lift within me, a burden I had not even realized I was carrying. The letters always contained the same message. You are stronger than you know. You are seen. You are valued. Keep going. And I meant every word. Some afternoons, I would sit on the porch of the old house, watching the wind move through the trees, reflecting on how life can strip everything away and still find a way to give something back. It was around this time that the first letter arrived from her. From my mother. It came in a plain envelope, careful handwriting on the front, no return address, but I knew. I let it rest on my desk for 3 days before I opened it. The letter was brief and halting, but it was the first thing she had written to me in decades. Evelyn, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if I have a right to ask, but I wanted you to know I see now what I was unable to see then. I spent my life wanting to become the woman you already were. And when I couldn't, I punished you for it. I read those words twice, then a third time, and then I wept. Not from anger, not from grief, but because sometimes broken things do not need to be repaired. Sometimes they only need to be acknowledged. We exchanged letters after that, slowly, carefully, without any sense of obligation. I did not forgive her immediately. I'm not certain I ever fully did, but I allowed the correspondence to continue. In those letters, she admitted things I never thought I would hear. That she had once dreamed of joining the Navy. That her own parents had extinguished that dream before it could take shape. That she had spent her life suspended between who she was and who she was permitted to be. And when I accomplished what she could not, when I broke free, she could not endure it. Jealousy is a merciless thing, but fear is worse. Her words did not erase the past. They did not alter what had been done, but they helped me understand. And sometimes understanding is the first movement toward peace. I remained absorbed in the foundation. We expanded the scholarship to encompass not only tuition, but counseling services, mentorship programs, and emergency grants for military families in crisis. It became more than an initiative, it became a purpose. I discovered that purpose has a transformative quality. I no longer looked in the mirror and saw the unwanted daughter. I no longer measure my worth against the acceptance of people who had never truly perceived me. I saw strength. I saw choice. I even began speaking at local events, something I never imagined I would do. I shared my story, not the scandal, not the headlines, but the authentic account of a girl who grew up unseen, who constructed a life no one had anticipated, who was broken and still found the will to rise. I did not speak for sympathy. I spoke for solidarity, because there are far more of us than people acknowledge. Those who carry invisible wounds, who have been told they're too much or not enough, who have been made to feel diminished within their own families, within their own skin. To them I said, "You are not what was done to you. You are what you choose next." The letters from my mother gradually slowed, then stopped altogether. I learned through a neighbor that she had become seriously ill, cancer, stage 4. I did not go to the hospital. I could not. Some lines, even when blurred, remained drawn. But I wrote to her one final time. "I hope you find peace." I wrote simply. "I have." She passed quietly 2 months later. Her funeral was small, no headlines, no public ceremony. I did not wear my uniform. I did not need to. I stood at the back, hands folded, and whispered a quiet farewell to the woman who had given me life and the woman who had taken so much of it. Then I let the wind carry the rest. In the years that followed, the Callahan Foundation grew. So did I. I found love, not the desperate kind, not the kind that seeks to fill old wounds, but the steady, gentle kind. I learned that family is not always determined by shared blood. Sometimes it is the people who appear when you fall, the ones who see you not as fractured, but as whole. I learned that legacy is not measured in wealth or renown. It is measured in the lives you touch, the stories you leave behind. And I learned, most profoundly, that justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is patient. Sometimes it is simply the choice to rise. In the end, I chose to rise. Forgiveness is a peculiar thing. People discuss it as though it functions like a switch, one day consumed by anger, the next at peace. But I came to understand it does not work that way. Not for me. The final letter from my mother arrived just weeks before she passed. Her handwriting was unsteady, almost illegible in places, but the words were unambiguous. She wrote, "Evelyn, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that now. I spent my life resenting you for pursuing the freedom I was too afraid to claim. I punished you for possessing the courage I lacked. And I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry." I read those words in silence. I did not weep. I did not feel rage. I sat with the letter folded in my lap, breathing slowly, deliberately. And for the first time, I felt the mass of something I had carried for decades begin to shift. Her apology arrived too late to repair anything, too late to reconstruct what had been shattered between us. But I realized it was not truly intended for her benefit. It was for mine. It granted me permission to stop running. I wrote back, just one line. "I accept your apology. I wish you peace." I never heard from her again. When she died, I did not speak at her funeral. I did not stand by the casket. But I stood near the old church steps, just as I had all those years ago when they had tried to exclude me from my own grandfather's farewell. Only this time, there was no bitterness in me, only quiet. I had come to understand that forgiveness is not always about the other person. Sometimes it is about liberating yourself from the necessity of continuing to bleed. I let go, but I did not forget. Some things you carry always. My brother Ryan took a different path. After the court proceedings, after the truth emerged and the community withdrew its favor from my family, I thought perhaps he might change. For a time, he appeared to. He kept a low profile, relocated to another state, began what seemed to be a legitimate enterprise. But patterns are difficult to sever when they have been your means of survival for too long. 2 years after our mother passed, I received a call. Ryan had been arrested, charged with multiple counts of financial fraud and embezzlement. He had defrauded dozens of people out of their savings, constructed an empire of deception, all of it collapsing precisely as it had before. This time, however, I felt nothing. No anger, no vindication, simply nothing. I did not attend a trial. I did not write to him in prison. I had no need to. Justice, I had come to understand, moves to its own rhythm. It does not always arrive when you demand it, but eventually it arrives. And when it does, you need not lift a finger to bring it about. The truth finds its way to the surface on its own. Some friends asked whether I felt vindicated, whether I wanted to push further to ensure the maximum sentence. I told them no. I had spent too many years trapped within that cycle. Retribution, resentment, self-righteousness. I had learned, often the hard way, that clutching anger simply keeps you bound to the very people who sought to destroy you. Ryan would answer for what he had done. The law would ensure it. But I was not going to spend another breath on him. Instead, I poured myself into what mattered. The Callahan Foundation continued to flourish. More scholarships, more lives transformed, more accounts of young men and women who would never be made to feel invisible the way I once had. I found joy in quiet, ordinary things. Morning walks, letters from scholarship recipients, telephone calls from fellow veterans who drew strength from my story. I found love, not the kind that sweeps you off your feet, but the kind that steadies you. Laura, my wife, brought a peace into my life I had not known was achievable. She did not recoil from my past. She did not offer me pity. She saw me, all of me, and I allowed her to. I still think about my mother sometimes. About Ryan. About the version of myself who once stood outside a locked church, too shattered to find her voice. But those thoughts no longer haunt me. They remind me. They remind me that survival is not simply a matter of enduring what is done to you. It is about choosing who you become in the aftermath. I chose to become someone my grandfather would have been proud of, someone my younger self would look at and say, "You made it. You are okay." That is the thing about forgiveness. It is not an eraser. It is not forgetting. It is choosing to live regardless, to move forward regardless, to love regardless. And that is enough. The sky was overcast the morning I returned to visit my grandfather's grave. There was something fitting about the gray clouds, the gentle breeze stirring the leaves, quiet, still, as though the world itself were pausing for a moment. I parked the car, walked the familiar path lined with weathered headstones, and found him. Harold Callahan, beloved father, veteran, the man who preserved me before I even knew I required saving. I stood there for a long time. I did not speak at first. I did not know how. How do you express gratitude to someone who offered you the only love that ever felt unconditional? How do you find words adequate to carry the weight of everything that has transpired since the last time you stood at their side? Eventually, I crouched down, my fingers brushing over his name carved in stone, and whispered softly, "They try, Grandpa. They try to take everything, but they couldn't because you taught me who I am." And I never forgot. I placed a single white rose beside the headstone, a small token, yet one that held everything I could not articulate. The memories came flooding in. The afternoons spent on his porch, the way he had taught me to lace my boots, the way his eyes always softened when he looked at me, as if he perceived the person I could become long before I could see her myself. He is the reason I endured, through the battles overseas and and the battles at home. Through the betrayal, the heartbreak, the loneliness, there are wounds that never fully heal. But dignity is something no one can ever strip from you. I rose, brushing the grass from my knees, and for the first time in years, I felt light. Not because the pain had departed, it had not, but because I had finally stopped permitting it to define me. I no longer hated my family. I no longer loved them either. I had allowed them to become what they were, a chapter, not the whole story. In the months following the court proceedings, life settled into a new rhythm. I directed the inheritance not toward myself, but toward others. The Callahan Veteran Scholarship Fund was established quietly, without ceremony, just as my grandfather would have wished. The first check went to the daughter of a retired Marine, someone who had been on the verge of withdrawing from college because her family could not afford the tuition. I met her briefly once. Her eyes reminded me of who I had once been, full of resolve, full of hope. And that was sufficient. The final image I will leave you with is not a courtroom. It is not of me in uniform. It is of me standing at the unveiling of a simple bronze plaque, Callahan Veteran Scholarship, in memory of Harold Callahan. For those who serve, for those who stand. And I know, deep within, that this is the true legacy. Not the suffering, not the betrayal, not the courtroom confrontations or the shattered promises. The legacy is resilience. It is the choice to build rather than to destroy, to forgive without forgetting, to rise without diminishing others in the process. Before we part ways, I would love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee in hand? Or perhaps a late night, when stories like this keep you company while the rest of the world sleeps? Let me know in the comments. We read every single one with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you love, or helped you find a little more strength to keep moving forward, I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel. Not merely to hear more stories like this one, but to become part of something greater, a community that still believes in kindness, in healing, in the possibility of second chances. Thank you. Thank you for offering me a piece of your time today. Thank you for allowing me to share this journey with you. Wherever you are, whatever you are carrying, I hope you remember, sometimes the miracle does not knock on your door. Sometimes it waits, quietly and patiently, until you are ready to open your heart and let it in. Take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next one.